Wren Mercer heard the bull before she saw the men. The sound came up through the dark like something torn loose from the earth itself. A furious bellow, the slam of wood, the rattle of iron chain against the side of the breeding pen. She was already out of bed before the second crash. Bare feet hit the cold plank floor. By the time she had her father's old lantern lit, she was halfway across the yard in her nightdress, one hand fisted around a wool coat, the other around the lantern handle, so tight the wire bit her palm. The yard smelled of trampled mud and rain that had not yet fallen. The moon kept slipping behind torn clouds. In the far pen, Atlas, the black Durham bull her father prized above every living thing on the ranch except her, hit the rails again hard enough to make the whole fence groan. And there were men in the pen with him. One held a lead rope. One was lifting the gate bar. The third turned at the flare of her lantern and shouted, "There she is. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We always like to know who's gathered around the fire with us." Wren did not scream. She snatched the branding poker from beside the trough, brought it up in both hands, and stepped through the open gate as if she had every right in the world to stand between thieves and 1,200 pounds of furious cattle. "Drop that rope," she said. The man nearest Atlas laughed. "Girl, you ought to go back inside." Wren moved closer instead. Atlas rolled one white-rimmed eye toward her, wild and bright. She knew that eye, knew the hitch in his breathing, the warning in the way his right flank quivered. Her father had taught her to read cattle the way some men read weather. A frightened animal looked for the steadiest heart in sight. So she kept her voice level. "Easy, boy. Easy now." Then she swung the poker hard into the wrist of the man holding the rope. He cursed. The rope fell. Atlas lunged. Wood cracked. The second man jumped back. The third came at her from the side, fast enough that she barely turned before his shoulders struck her chest and drove the breath out of her. The lantern flew from her hand and burst in the mud. Darkness slammed down. She heard Atlas bellow again, heard boot heels, felt a hand seize a fistful of her hair. Should have stayed in bed. A voice said close to her ear, smooth and unhurried. Not one of the hired hands. A man used to being obeyed. Wren twisted and drove her elbow backward. It connected with somebody's ribs. For one sharp second the grip loosened. She got half a breath, half a step, and then a cloth went over her mouth that smelled sweet and rotten all at once. The last thing she saw before the dark took her was Atlas smashing through the broken rail and running blind into the night. At sunrise, Gideon Mercer found his daughter's coat in the mud and the bull pen hanging open like a broken jaw. That morning he did not knock before entering her room. The bed was empty. The quilt dragged half to the floor. The window stood open though Wren hated night air. On the sill, caught on a splinter, was one long chestnut hair. By breakfast the story had spread from the cookhouse to the livery and halfway down Main Street. By noon it had changed shape 3 times. First the prized bull was gone. Then Mercer's daughter was gone too. By 1 o'clock somebody claimed she had run off with a horse trader from Helena. By 2, the town had decided she must have helped steal the bull herself, because people will believe a bitter thing before they believe a complicated one. Gideon let them talk. Then he saddled his bay gelding and rode into town with Wren's coat folded under his arm and murder sitting so plain on his face that men stepped aside before he reached the boardwalk. He found Eli Thorne behind the blacksmith shop, resetting a shoe on a ranch mare that did not belong to him. Eli looked up once and knew at once this was no ordinary ask. He was younger than Gideon by 15 years and carried himself with the careful stillness of a man who had once moved too quickly and paid for it. Bitter Creek called him drifter, scout, trouble, depending on who was speaking and how much whiskey had been swallowed. Gideon called him when something mattered. "My daughter is gone," Gideon said. Eli drove the last nail clean through the shoe, set the hoof down, and wiped his hand on a rag. "Tell me what you found." By the time Gideon finished, Eli's face had changed very little, but something in him had tightened. He asked about the cloth smell, asked whether the broken rail bent inward or out, asked if Wren had fought. Gideon held out the coat. Eli studied the mud spattered hem, then the torn cuff, then the faint streak of blood along one sleeve. "She fought," he said. Gideon nodded once. "I'll track them." Sheriff Nolan Rusk arrived before they could leave, broad in the middle and always a touch out of breath, his badge dull with dust. "Now hold on," he said. "Could be the girl left of her own mind." Gideon turned slowly enough to make the sheriff regret speaking. My daughter doesn't climb out a window barefoot in a storm, he said. And she doesn't bleed on her own coat for the pleasure of it. Rusk tugged at his collar. I'm only saying there's another angle. There always is, Eli said mildly. That's how cowards keep from doing the obvious thing. The trail began beyond the lower pasture where the ground turned soft. 3 horses, one heavy with a rider that shifted. One set of deep drag marks where Atlas had fought the lead rope. Eli crouched, touched the churned mud, and looked toward the pines rising black against the western ridge. They took the creek road first, he said, then left it to cut north. They know enough to hide sign, not enough to hide it well. Gideon swung into the saddle. As they rode, the day sharpened around them. Pine heat, horse sweat, the bitter tang of dust coating the back of the throat. Every draw, every stand of spruce, every wash of yellow stone seemed another place a man could lose the one thing left to him. Wren had grown into the best stockhand Gideon had ever known, but half the men in Bitter Creek still laughed behind their cups when she came to auction with account books under one arm and dust on her boots. Let them laugh, Gideon used to think. One day they'll choke on it. Near noon they found the first sign Wren had left for them. It was not much. Only a strip torn from her petticoat, knotted low in a chokecherry bush where no wind could have caught it by accident. Gideon reached for it with a hand that did not feel like his own. She's alive, he said. She wants us to know it, Eli answered. 2 miles later they found the lead rope hanging from a branch, and, below it, black hair caught in bark. Atlas had broken free again. Eli dismounted and studied the scuffed ground. Bull headed east, he said. Men went west with the girl. Gideon's jaw hardened. Then the bull was never the point. No, Eli looked toward the higher country where abandoned mining shacks still rotted above Bitter Creek. He was cover. Gideon did not ask the next question aloud, because once spoken it became larger, heavier, harder to survive. Who takes a woman for cover? Not boys stealing livestock. Not drunks. Men with a plan. Men with power. There was only one man in Bitter Creek with enough nerve and enough need to risk both theft and abduction in the same night. Silas Cutter owned the feed store, the bank note on half the valley, and 300 head he had built into 1,200 through foreclosures and marriages nobody called tender. He smiled with all his teeth and shook hands like he was counting your bones. Twice he had tried to buy the spring pasture from Gideon. Twice Gideon had refused. The spring pasture meant water. Water meant leverage. And Atlas, with his proven calves and clean bloodline, meant Mercer stock would double in value by next year. Silas had asked once, in front of witnesses, what Gideon meant to do with all that when he had no son. Gideon had answered, leave it to the child who earned it. Silas had looked at Wren then with a kind of polished contempt that could skin paint. A daughter is sentimental business, he had said. Wren had met his gaze and closed the account book. Only to men who can't count. If you were in Gideon's place right then, what would you have done? Would you have ridden straight to Silas Cutter's house and burned the truth out of him, or trusted the trail and the one man in the valley calm enough to read it? Tell us in the comments, because there's no easy courage in a choice like that. Gideon did not ride to Silas's house. That was the harder choice, and therefore the one that mattered. He stayed with Eli in the trail because rage wanted the quickest road and love wanted the right one. By late afternoon they reached Old Kettle Ridge, where the pines thinned and the land broke into ledges of slate. Eli lifted a hand. Fresh smoke drifted somewhere above them. Faint, intermittent, hidden. Not campfire smoke. Greenwood tossed on flame by someone who did not care if the world knew he was there, because he believed the world belonged to him. They tied off the horses in a draw and climbed the rest on foot. The cabin sat in a pocket of stone with its back to the ridge and only one clear approach. Through the warped boards of the window Gideon saw one lamp, a table, a rifle propped by the door, and Wren tied to a straight-back chair with a bruise darkening along one cheekbone like spilled ink. Silas Cutter sat opposite her, coat off, waistcoat neat, as if he were conducting business in his office instead of holding a stolen woman in a mountain shack. And Wren, God help him, was talking as calm as if she were bargaining over hay. You can't sell Atlas anywhere near here, she was saying. Everybody knows his head, his shoulders, the split in his left ear. You'll be caught by Tuesday. Silas smiled. Then it's fortunate the bull no longer concerns me. Gideon's fist closed around the stock of his rifle until the old wound in his knuckle lit up white-hot. "What do you want?" Wren asked. "You saw the ledger." That stopped Gideon colder than any gun could have. Silas leaned back. "I keep a storage room under the feed store for papers not meant for public eyes. You wandered where you ought not and found that ledger. Brands altered. Weights changed. Notes called early on men who never missed a payment until I made sure they did." He spread his hands. Ugly work, but profitable. Wren's lip was split. She tasted blood and straightened anyway. "You took ranches from widows. I took weakness from fools." "No," she said quietly. "You took from people who trusted the law to mean what it said." Silas's face changed then. Not much. Just enough to show the contempt beneath the polish. "And now you know why your father's spring pasture matters. Water, rail access, breeding stock. Bitter Creek is growing up, Miss Mercer. Men like your father call it theft because they are too small to call it progress." Wren looked toward the door once. Too quick for Silas to notice. Not too quick for Gideon to see. Warning, not hope. There were others. As if summoned by the thought, boot steps scraped outside. Eli, low beside Gideon in the brush, touched 2 fingers to the ground and drew a short line. "Wait." Another man entered the cabin carrying a coil of rope. Jed Cutter, Silas's nephew. Mean-eyed, eager, the sort who mistook cruelty for manhood because it was the only power he could afford. "She still won't say where the second key is," Jed said. Silas kept his eyes on Wren. "Her father has it. The safe at the bank. The box in his office. The deed I need is in there." Signed papers turned theft into business. Everything inside Gideon went still. They had not only taken Wren. They meant to force the spring pasture from him clean on paper, while the whole town whispered his daughter had run wild. Wren drew a slow breath. "You'll never make him sign." Silas stood. Every man signs, given the proper leverage. He reached for her jaw. Wren jerked away, and Jed laughed. Eli's hand closed on Gideon's sleeve before he could rise. There was no reproach in the grip, only iron restraint. "Wait. One more second. The right second." Then Wren did something Gideon would remember until his dying day. She spat blood in Silas Cutter's face. Everything moved at once. Silas cursed and lunged. Wren drove both boots against the table edge. The lamp toppled. Oil flashed across the boards. Jed grabbed for the rifle by the door. Eli fired through the window before the barrel cleared the rack. Glass burst inward. Jed screamed and dropped. Gideon hit the door shoulder first. The frame split. Smoke punched into his lungs. Silas had Wren by one arm, dragging her backward toward the rear room as flame climbed the wall in greasy orange sheets. "Down!" Eli shouted. A shot tore through the cabin. Wood exploded above Gideon's head. He fired once and missed because Wren was between them. Silas hauled her through the inner door. Gideon vaulted the table, kicked apart the burning lamp, and slashed at the ropes binding her wrists with the skinning knife he always carried in his boot. Behind him, Jed was scrambling one-handed for the fallen rifle. Eli came through the broken window like a thrown blade, drove his knee into Jed's chest, and sent the weapon skidding under the stove. "Take her," Eli barked, but Wren was already on her feet. Her wrists were raw. Smoke streamed past her eyes. She grabbed the iron poker from the hearth and turned toward the rear room where Silas had disappeared. "Wren," Gideon began. "He knows the back trail," she said. "If he gets the ridge, he's gone." She ran before either man could stop her. The rear door banged open into evening light. Beyond it, the slope dropped hard toward a shale cut where a horse waited tied among scrub pine. Silas was halfway to the saddle. Wren charged downhill after him, boots sliding on loose rock. Gideon followed, lungs tearing. Eli was somewhere behind, wrestling breath and blood and smoke alike. Silas swung into the saddle and reached for the reins. Wren slammed the poker into the horse's flank. The animal reared. Silas lost one stirrup, cursed, and grabbed mane. Wren caught his boot with both hands and pulled with every pound of the body half the valley had always called too big, too stubborn, too much. He crashed sideways out of the saddle and hit the shale with a sound like a sack of grain dropped from height. Silas rolled, came up with a derringer no bigger than a child's fist, and fired. The shot missed Wren's heart by inches and tore through the sleeve of her coat. She did not even seem to feel it. She drove the poker down into his wrist. The derringer flew. Silas screamed. Then Gideon reached them. He could have killed the man then. God knows a part of him still wishes he had. But Wren was standing over Silas with smoke in her hair and blood on her mouth and a steadiness in her eyes that looked older than anything he had ever given her. "Don't," she said. It was not mercy. It was something harder. "He dies quick that way." Below them came the pounding of hooves. Sheriff Rusk, 2 deputies, and 3 ranchers from Bitter Creek burst into the clearing, drawn by smoke and rifle fire. Last among them, black hide gleaming in the dusk, came Atlas himself, lathered and furious, trailing half a lead rope and enough wild authority to make every horse shy sideways. Silas saw the men, saw the sheriff, saw, too late, the end of all his careful paper walls. Wren stooped, picked up the derringer, and held it by the barrel. "Search the storage room under his feed store," she said to Rusk before the sheriff could even ask what had happened. "There's a ledger. Altered brands, false weights, forced notes, stolen deeds." He took half this valley one lie at a time. Rusk blinked at her, then at Silas, then at Gideon, then finally at Eli, who said in the tone of a man done nursing other people's cowardice, "If you waste another minute, he'll have someone burning it already." The quiet after violence can feel stranger than violence itself. An hour later the fire was out. Jed Cutter was trussed to a pine like a hog for market, and Silas sat handcuffed in the back of the sheriff's wagon with his ruined wrist wrapped in a strip torn from his own expensive shirt. The sky had gone the soft blue that comes only when the mountains are thinking about night. Wren sat on a blanket near the spring below the cabin while Gideon cleaned the cut along her arm. His hands shook only once, when he saw how close the bullet had come. "I taught you to swing at men bigger than you," he said quietly. "You taught me not to let them finish what they start." His mouth almost moved toward a smile, then failed halfway there. "I should have seen what Cutter was building sooner." Wren watched the last of the light move across the creek. "You saw enough. He only got this far because people like him count on decent men believing the rules still mean something." Gideon tied off the bandage and sat back on his heels. For a while he only listened, to creek water, to the soft grind of Atlas tearing grass somewhere in the dark, to his own heartbeat settling one painful notch at a time. Then he said the thing he had not said in 19 years of fathering her. "I have spent half your life being afraid the world would take you from me." Wren did not look at him. "I know. And the other half being afraid it would break you." This time she turned. "It broke me some," she said. "Just not in a way that kept me from standing back up." A little way off, Eli was washing blood from his knuckles in the creek. Wren watched him for a second longer than accident required. When Gideon followed her gaze, he saw the patience in him, the way he had never once tried to make himself the hero of another man's grief. Gideon rose and left them the space before either could ask for it. Eli came over after a minute and lowered himself onto the far edge of the blanket with the care of someone approaching a skittish mare. "How bad?" he asked, glancing at her bandaged arm. "Enough to annoy me." "That's a healthy sign." She laughed softly, then winced at the pull of bruised ribs. The sound of her own laughter seemed to surprise her. Eli studied the creek rather than her face. "Back in New Mexico," he said, "I once lost a whole remuda because I trusted the wrong man to take second watch. Thought for years the mistake was trusting anybody at all." He rubbed a thumb over the scar near his collar. "Turns out the mistake was giving one bad man the power to decide what I'd become after." Wren folded her hands in her lap. The skin there was scraped, dirt still in the lines. "I used to think grief worked the same way. Like one loss could decide the whole shape of your life if you let it. And now—" She looked at Atlas in the meadow, huge and black against the darkening grass. "Now I think the heart is stubborn stock. It spooks. It kicks. But if you stay with it, it'll come back to hand." Eli turned then, and whatever sat between them felt both new and long overdue. "That," he said softly, "is a line worth keeping." Wren's mouth curved. "You can borrow it if you have need." He shook his head. "I reckon I'd rather remember who said it." If this story is moving you, you're exactly who we tell these stories for. A like and a subscribe lets us know to keep bringing these quiet hearts and hard-won endings back to your evening. When they rode into Bitter Creek the next morning, the whole town was waiting. News travels fast in small places, but shame travels faster. Men who had shrugged the day before now stood hat in hand as the sheriff's wagon rolled up to the boardwalk. Women leaned from mercantile windows. Boys climbed hitch rails for a better look. The widow Baines crossed herself when she saw Wren upright in the saddle. Sheriff Rusk did one good thing in his life before noon. He walked straight from the wagon to the feed store, kicked open the locked storage room beneath it, and came out carrying ledgers, deeds, forged notes, and enough evidence to hang the good name clean off Silas Cutter forever. By 3 o'clock the bank examiner from Helena had been telegraphed. By sunset Silas's accounts were frozen, his properties attached, and every rancher whose land he had taken by fraud had a lawful claim filed against his estate. Jed sang like a church sinner once the deputies mentioned prison in Deer Lodge. The truth did not mend Bitter Creek's conscience, but it did strip it bare. At the hearing 2 days later, the courthouse overflowed. Gideon testified. So did Eli. Then Wren stood, broad and unbowed in her plain blue dress, and read from Silas's own ledger in a voice steady enough to shame the walls. Name after name, widow after widow, acre after acre. When she finished, nobody laughed at the rancher's daughter with the account books. Silas Cutter lost everything that month. His bank note holdings, his feed store, his cattle contracts, his seat on the county board, his house with its imported wallpaper and polished walnut doors. The court found fraud, coercion, abduction, and conspiracy enough to bury what remained. He was sent east in irons with no dignity left but the kind a man invents for himself in silence. No one in Bitter Creek invented any for him. The spring pasture stayed with the Mercers. And because law can occasionally arrive late and still matter, 5 families got their deeds back before winter, including the widow Baines, who wept over the papers as if they were living flesh. As for the town, it had to learn Wren anew. It learned her on auction day when she stepped into the ring and sold 3 yearlings at the highest price Mercer stock had ever fetched. It learned her when she corrected the rail agent's figures without glancing at the page. It learned her when men who once spoke past her began speaking to her and discovered she had not grown softer just because they had finally grown eyes. One evening, after the hearing, Gideon found Eli in the south pasture mending a gate Atlas had tested beyond reason. You aiming to keep drifting? Gideon asked. Depends whether there's cause to stay. There's honest work here, Gideon said. More than that, if earned. Eli waited. Gideon cleared his throat. My daughter thinks before she trusts. If she ever trusts you, don't make a fool of her. Eli's answer came without hesitation. I'd sooner make a fool of myself. That night Wren stood on the porch with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand and listened to the ranch settle into dark. The horses shifting in the corral, the far cough of a coyote, the boards under her bare feet still warm from the day's sun. Eli came up the steps carrying a small brass compass. He turned it once in his palm and held it out to her. What's this for? She asked. For keeping, he said. I'm tired of carrying things that only point backward. She looked at the compass, then at him. That sounds almost hopeful. It's worse than that. His voice roughened at the edges. It's honest. Wren took the compass. Their fingers touched and stayed that way a heartbeat longer than manners required. He had walked through fire and gun smoke beside her. She had pulled a powerful man out of the saddle with the exact strength the world had mocked in her. Maybe that is how some kinds of love begin, not with ease, but with seeing clearly what the world got wrong. In the first weeks of spring, the lower pasture shone green clear to the creek, and calves moved through it like dropped pieces of sunlight. Wren stood at the fence with Eli's hand warm at the small of her back, while Gideon, hat tipped low, watched peace settle over everything he loved. On the porch behind them lay the widow Baines's seed catalog, the restored deeds of 5 families, and a brass compass catching morning light. All of it proof that sometimes what the cruel mean to steal becomes the very thing that teaches a life where home is. And beyond the pasture, under a sky washed clean as new tin, the ranch held steady in the gold of evening, as if it had finally remembered it was allowed to last. Next time, we'll tell the story of a deaf schoolteacher sent west to disappear quietly, and the widowed ranch foreman who was the first man alive to understand that her silence had never meant weakness.